everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with Kyell, author of Waterways and other books, and also with Brian, my partner in crime for our Infernal Intercourse series, where we discuss theology in the TV show Lucifer. And if you're interested in that, just head over to that playlist. But for today, we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess, boundary breaking, boundary pushing ideas and books, because Kyell has written some books where we have people who are animal people, and he has put different religions in there, including Christianity, and has tried to think about how Christianity would be different if you lived in a world of people who were animals and not humans. So that sounds very interesting. We'll learn more about that from Kyell. Also, might learn a little bit about various ideas of the furry community from both Kyell and Pastor Brian. So welcome both to Kyell and Brian. And so I'll just start off, Kyell, with asking you about what prompted you to put Christianity in a book. Because a lot of times fantasy and science fiction authors seem to shy away from religion. Even when they have a fantasy world where you think religion would be very important, you find that maybe it's either not there or just sort of sketched out a little bit, or they don't really have that part developed. But it sounds like you put a lot of thought into how you would have your characters interact with religion.
Yeah, I started kind of some of the earliest books that I wrote was like a Renaissance era fantasy series, and I'd made up my own church in that. It wasn't necessarily based on any human country or world, but I'd given them a religion because I do remember reading that criticism as far back as 10, 20 years ago. It seems an ongoing thing where people neglect religion, whereas it was a huge part of people's lives. With Waterways, that was my first book in really a contemporary world, and it's a gay coming of age story. And at the time I wrote it, which was in the mid 2000s, there was a lot of animosity in the gay community towards this organized religion, and also the other way around. But I had a friend who was gay, who was becoming a minister. I had gay friends who had positive experiences with the church. One of my best friends is a devout Catholic who has been very accepting of gay people, and I came out to him early on, and he's been great. And so I wanted to put into a fiction story a positive experience with a religious figure, with someone from organized religion who actually embodied the kindness and tolerance that is the message in a lot of Christ's teachings.
Okay, so obviously another one of the boundaries that you're either pushing or breaking is having gay characters as well. So this is like furry characters, queer characters, just kind of encompassing a lot of communities that would be on the margins, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Although I just don't really have, animal people, but if we did, they'd be on the margins like they are in your collation series, right?
Right.
So trying to look at stories from that point of view.
Yeah, and the books that I write, the world is entirely composed of animal people, so it's not as much like, a world of humans and then the animal people are pushed off to the side. But the audience of people who appreciate stories about animal people is a smaller and at the time marginalized, I guess, possibly still is, although the furry community has definitely grown quite a bit since I published Waterways. But yeah, and also, there were some queer narratives. Of course, the coming of age queer story is a staple of the community. But I wanted to write my version of it and make it feel realistic.
Mm-hmm.
which seems like maybe an odd goal for a world where you've written a whole bunch of animal people into it. But I think the whole point of it is that they're human too, and we're just viewing it through a different lens.
Mm-hmm. So Brian, go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, that was a question I was going to ask, and you kind of answered it, which is, it makes sense to me from a pastoral counseling standpoint, I guess, that it's easier to view critiques of ourselves. It's easier to view our faults, and it's also easier to be inspired by perhaps humans that are slightly different, or in your case, humans that are animals. So that makes good sense to me why that would be a powerful way to do that.
And that is really one of the roles science fiction plays, right?
Mm-hmm.
You look at the original Star Trek, and Roddenberry would stick all these social justice issues in, but the people would be green or whatever. And then that takes it, it's 300 years in the future. So when people see these sorts of things, they don't necessarily feel like they're being attacked per se, exactly, because now they're in the sort of fantasy world in the future and things are different, but they're still getting the same messages that are about, social justice. So that's one of the things that science fiction really has been, I guess, good for, is that it's not really about the future, it's really about now, but you kind of give it some window dressing. It makes people, it's easier for them to digest it, I guess, in a way, some of those messages.
Definitely. And it might seem weird to say it again about, fantasy animal people, but my protagonist is a teenager who's an otter, and in a way that makes him easier for people to identify with, depending on their mindset, than if I'd said, well, he's a white suburban kid from the upper Midwest. And then, as soon as you put race into it, or, whatever, he has an economic background, but it's, vaguely somewhere in lower to upper middle class. So, but as soon as you drop a lot of cultural baggage onto it, you start to exclude people. Or, if I'd said he's a black kid growing up in the suburbs in the upper Midwest, then that lets another group identify with him and exclude some others. Mm-hmm. So making him a fantasy character means anyone can say, oh, well, what if I was an otter? And it doesn't matter as much what specific ways you match up in your actual background with his fictional background.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, when we're talking about boundaries, Brian and I had just done, like a month ago, a episode of our Infernal Intercourse about queer theology, and Brian had brought up some points on how queer theology is all about things like on the margins and the boundaries. And then, of course, we talked about the characters on Lucifer and that. But that is something that's important, right? That Jesus went to people who were on the margins, right? He talked to women and Samaritans and lepers and whoever. And so you have a kind of a tie-in there with Christianity and boundaries.
So on that boundary thing, yeah, I brought in kind of a definition of queer, right, which is itself, for some people, a new form. I think we've been using it in academia since the 80s, maybe. But because it's a reclaimed word, I think some people have some trouble with that. But especially with queer theologians, we would define queer as choosing to be in the margins, not seeking the center of power, but demanding that we can be our queer selves in the margins, particularly standing with a view from below, right? Like that would be a queer theology. And so I do think it's the question I have, and I don't know, it may not affect your books. I will now read your books. I haven't had a chance to read them, but I'm kind of excited to read them. And but so it occurs to me that one of the problems we have is that people see Jesus as a blonde, U.S. straight cis man, right? And that's how they picture him. And so it occurs to me it could be very interesting how an otter would picture Jesus, right? And that is a very queer, but it's also kind of boundary breaking, but it is also moving toward a more liberative and justice way of dealing with spirituality.
Right. That was something that I ran up against too. And I grew up Catholic, so I had that picture of Jesus in all of the books that I saw for a while. And I think Kevin Smith's Dogma was the first time I saw Jesus portrayed as a black man. And then Avenue Q also brought that up. And then, so the more you read about it, the more you're like, does it really make sense for someone who was born in the Middle East to have been a light-skinned European blonde person? But when I'm building the world, I'm trying to base it on our contemporary world, but with changes that make sense for the people living in it. And so trivial examples are things like, well, if everyone has a tail, you wouldn't have fully backed chairs because they'd be uncomfortable, or you would have them, but they'd be big armchairs where you could curl your tail around and sit there and it would be comfortable. But if it's just, you're sitting in a cafeteria, you would have the chairs that are just a seat and then like the back, and then your tail goes through it or goes around the back or something. So when I'm trying to think about creating a church that's based on the Catholic Church, roughly, because that's what I'm most familiar with, and the ways that the Catholic Church tried to appeal to people down the ages, what I came up with was a church that presents Jesus as having 12 different aspects, each one as a different species. And so, for instance, there is a lion Christ who is kind of the Christ that the lions, tigers, other big cats all sort of identify with. And in fact, like, people don't just use his name as an oath in the stories. They identify by the species which one they're identifying with. So I have my series about a football player. He's a tiger, and so when he's exasperated, he says "Lion Christ" a lot of the time. But yeah, I figured that a church that would become popular over the entire world, in a world where the population is divided into different animal species, races, would have to have something that would appeal to as many of them as possible. And so with my Catholic background, I have the sort of the Holy Trinity, the three who are one. And so it didn't seem like that big a leap to have one person embodied in 12 different aspects.
So I'm kind of curious, when you do these 12 different aspects, they're mixed between, say, like predator and prey species. Is that a big deal with anyone in this world that, tigers eat otters? Or is this sort of Zootopia where we just don't mention it?
It isn't. There's a loose dichotomy that the predator species eat meat, but the prey species don't. But in the same way that we aren't necessarily identifying with things that chimpanzees do in the forest, like, we've separated ourselves from them, and the sapient species in my world have separated themselves from the feral species and whatever they do. And you're like, well, we're different. We've evolved. We don't do that kind of thing anymore. Like, we don't eat people. I mean, chimpanzees eat other chimpanzees sometimes, but like, that's not even a thing that we talk about very much. They don't define our behavior, unless we want to go to the natural world for some moralistic thing or another. So it isn't really that big a deal. There are domesticated animals, but one of the rules of my furry world is that there aren't intelligent people versions of domesticated animals in general. So I don't have some people in their furry worlds have like German Shepherd people walking around. I don't have domestic dogs or domestic pigs or domestic sheep. There's boars, there's bulls. Those are whatever the wild types are, but not the domestic animals, because my reasoning is someone had to domesticate those animals and turn them into what they are now. And if I'm positing that animals all kind of evolved in parallel to be upright and sapient and whatever, then who's domesticating an intelligent species of wolf to turn them into different kinds of dogs? So I personally don't have that in my world, but other people do.
Okay. So we were discussing earlier before I started recording that a lot of this has to do with like nature, and is it like respecting nature, getting back to nature with the furry communities you've seen, Brian? Is that one of the things that's important to them?
Well, and I specifically asked some questions of the furry community before this interview to get a sense of that. And I think it's interesting, similar to what we have talked about already today. Yes, the furry community loves animals, particularly the animal with which they identify, but it is also a way to magnify traits of themselves and the humanity, and they see themselves as a community, and not so much, let's say, a pack of wolves, but a human community of furries. I guess I'm not really a good authority on using the right language, but so
that's about right.
Yeah, and so that's I think that's an interesting aspect of what you're sharing, is this idea that it brings out it brings out aspects of who we are as humans, right? And it, obviously we're a mix of many things, but it brings that out, and I think that's kind of interesting.
I know from being I've been in the furry community for going on almost 30 years at this point. It'll be 30 years later this year. And yeah, that, I mean, you said it very well. Just having a furry alter ego helps us examine aspects of ourselves. Sometimes it represents who we are, and sometimes it represents who we want to be. In both a sense of, these are the aspects of myself that I identify and I want to amplify, and these are aspects of myself that I want to change and improve. And people can also have different alter egos for different moods or different, I guess, moods or times that they're going through. Like, they can say, for example, snow leopards are very isolated and solitary animals in general. Wolves are more pack animals, so someone might have both a wolf and a snow leopard alter ego and just be saying like, oh, I'm feeling more snow leopard today, I don't want to talk to anyone.
Yeah. I think that's interesting too, because I'm also familiar with puppy play, which is a very different thing, which, again, my understanding of that is that they're trying to be as little like a human and as much like a dog when they're engaging in that. So that would be very different, I think, from furries, and very different from what you're saying as well. So
yeah, it is. I'm not as familiar with the pup play. I'm aware of it. I have some friends in that community, and you're right. That's more about kind of leaving your humanity behind, and like a lot of fetish play, I think it's mostly about control, and the idea that when you're a puppy, you're absolutely not in control at all. And that's a way to role play that feels right for some people.
Yeah, they're usually looking for a handler or something like that. Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
So bringing back to the creation, I would call it green theology, creation theology. It seems like what you're describing, and even some of the furries that I talked to felt a little uncomfortable, but I have an assumption that whether it's full-blown puppy play, whether it's furry play, or even your human animals, that even if it's not on a conscious level, this idea of connecting animals to humanity has to, in my opinion, increase our appreciation for creation and nature, which seems to be kind of a queer theology, a new way of thinking of theology, and of course a big movement just in our culture. And so I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, one of the things that I like about the furry community is the diversity in it, and I don't just mean of the backgrounds. People will point out that the furry community is predominantly white and male, which it is. But what I mean is the diversity in the interests in the species, in the alter egos, the way that people identify themselves. There are certain people who love to go find obscure animals. I have a friend who has a pangolin alter ego. If you didn't know, pangolins, the scaly anteaters, and
I know a
those are
pangolin
great
as well. That's funny.
Yeah. I love pangolins. They're fantastic. But there's certainly an appreciation, and even if you're not one of the people who's like, I want to go out and find the weirdest animal and the strangest animal and be part of that, you definitely appreciate when someone comes up with a furry character and you're like, oh, I don't know what that is. Tell me about it. And you get very excited and you're like, oh, wow, is that a real thing? Where do they live? And you're like, oh, well, it's this, species that lives in India, just around Nepal or whatever. But there is definitely a general sense that the world is huge and contains so much to appreciate and explore and be fascinated by. I think that you're definitely right that that's part of it.
And is that part of your books? Do you think that your characters add to that as well?
That's generally like I was guilty early on in my books of using the most common species a lot. I identify as a fox, so my books are just like full of foxes all over the place. Foxes. Even in the book about an otter, he falls in love with a fox. But as it goes on, I've tried to expand out and work with different species. A book I put out last year has a fruit bat character in it, and so that was fun. I had the artist was going to do an illustration, and they were like, hey, so how do you envision the anatomy working? Because like their wings are their arms, and so, but also like their fingers make part of the wings. So do they just have like two fingers, hands, or are you making some kind of hybrid thing where they have a hand and then the wing comes off of it? And so we had to go back and forth, and I found that people have drawn them in like 6 different ways they deal with it. Sometimes like they have wings, but then they also have arms. And then sometimes they have arms and the wings just kind of come down off the wrist. And sometimes it's like, well, 2 of their fingers form the wing, but then they have a real hand. And it's fun. People just, whatever you can imagine. And a lot of it is based in the real world. Some of it is based in fantasy. There's dragons and unicorns and Pegasus and whatever else people can think of. But it's a huge world. But my books focus mostly on human experiences and human stories told through the lens of what if it was in this world of animal people, and how would that change our expectations of ourselves and of others, and the stereotypes that we and prejudices that we put onto people.
Okay, that's really interesting. I look forward to reading some of that too. I did buy this book that is the other series that he has written, and so you can always check out those books. I'm pretty sure you have an Amazon page, Kyell.
Yes.
So you can just search for Kyell Gold on Amazon, look his books up there. And so I encourage you to buy those, support your authors that you like. And Brian, any final thoughts on furries or anything?
There was just one other thing that you mentioned that really stuck out to me, and it's a big debate in queer theology. Like people want to say, well, there was no such thing as gay back in biblical times or whatever. It's a modern concept, things like that. And so, and going all the way back to Nancy Wilson in the 80s saying, our tribe, we've always existed in every place and every time. They may not have identified as gay, but I know men loved men the way I love men in every place and every time, every culture. So I think it's an interesting choice to take animals like you did and move them into a past time from a queer perspective, because, you know, people still we're invisible and we're erased in a lot of places, but they're not going to argue lions didn't exist in the Middle Ages, right? Like they're not going to argue, right, that those things didn't exist in biblical times. So it's yet another great tool to insert queer sensibility into other times where it's not documented or it's erased or invisible. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. There is a little bit of a cheat with writing furry fiction. For instance, the series there, that The Tower and the Fox, which is a historical series that includes animal people in a human world, for reasons that I won't get into here. The animal people are more accepting of queer relationships, and there is in fact one in the book. But also, if you go back and read things from the 1800s, at least the early part of the 1800s, they were also accepting of queer relationships. Just, you know, Abraham Lincoln slept in the same bed as another clerk when he was working his way through school or just out of school. And like all of this happened. But the cheat is people can say, well, this thing isn't historically accurate. This thing didn't happen in that time. And I can always come back and say, right, but we also didn't have talking animal people in that time. So I'm taking liberties, and that's fine.
Right. Great tool. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pastor Brian and Kyell Gold, for joining me today on my channel. Remember, if you like this video, hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.